Hi folks, if you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. For those of you who are returning, you may notice that my setup looks a little different now. And let me know what you think about that. This is a bit of an experiment. I'm trying something out. I changed my location for my recording studio. I thought maybe this would be a little more inviting, a little more warm and welcoming rather than just blank white walls. So if you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, still let me know. I really want to know what your feedback is because this is for you. Whichever one you prefer, I'm okay with. But I need to know how you feel about it. So, by the way, apologies for that little, I guess it's on the side here, this little glare here and glare up here. That's just kind of circumstantial. The lights are on and they reflect off of that painting. So that's not something I'm going to be able to do. But if you like the setup, let me know. Anyway, we were speaking of Abram and Sarai. And we're going to continue in that. We're going to finish out the story of Abram and Sarai. If you'll recall where we left off last time, God had promised Abraham a son. And Abraham said, God, I don't have one yet. What's going on? God said, don't worry about it. I'm still going to give you a son. And Sarai gets the bright idea and says, look, maybe we need to take matters into our own hands. Maybe we're being too idle. Maybe God wants us to, create the situation. And so she says, I got an idea. How about you sleep with my maid and have a son through her? And then we can, adopt him and he'll be part of our family. And he'll still count as your son. That'll fulfill the covenant, right? So it's okay. Years are working. I don't know what Abram was thinking at the time. My first reaction would be, that's a trap and I'm not going to fall for that. But things are different back then. Maybe he thought, well, she gave permission. Okay. I don't know. I don't know what he's thinking, but he agrees to it. And, he has a son born. And, the last verse in chapter 16 is the last chapter we left off on. And, the last verse in that chapter says, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So it's been 11 years. He was 75 when he was promised a son. 11 years later, they waited 11 years with no son, and that's why Sarai got a little bit antsy. She says, okay, I got a plan. Here's how we're going to have a kid. But that was not God's plan. And we see that in the next time that God and Abram speak. And we see that in chapter 17, which is where we're going to start. We're going to start in chapter 17, excuse me. Chapter 17, verse 1. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. And it says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. So God is re-emphasizing his promise here. He says, listen, I have not forgotten my promise. I am going to keep my promise. You are going to be a father of many nations, and to sort of exonerate the promise and re-emphasize it, I'm going to change your name. And so most people refer to this character as Abraham, not Abram, because he was known as Abram for the more pivotal moments in his life, as we'll see. Moving on to verse 15, we see that Abraham was not the only one with a name change. Verse 15 says, then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So we see here God is correcting Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, whichever name you prefer. But as they are now Abraham and Sarah, that's how I will be referring to them. He's correcting their view and saying, look, I know you guys had your own plan, but that was never my plan. My plan was for Sarah to have a child, not Sarah's servant to have a child. And he says, but because Ishmael is your son, and I did promise you that you would be, fruitful and be many nations, I will also make him many nations. So Abraham will indeed have many, many, many descendants through these two lineages. And we see, again, continuing on this theme of the promise of a child, we get a little more specific. Jumping down to chapter 18, the first couple of verses, and then we're going to jump down to verse 9, says, Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground. So there's 3 men. One of them is the Lord, and there are 2 others. We'll find out who they are a bit later. Jumping down to verse 9, it says, Then they said to him, Where is Sarah your wife? So he said, Here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening in on the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I surely bear a child, since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, No, but you did laugh. Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. So a few things to note here. 1, you can't hide anything from God. If you laugh, he knows about it. And he didn't scold her. He just says, there's no reason to laugh. I can do all things. Is there anything too hard for me? The answer is no. But we see here the men who were with him begin to get up and leave. And we don't know yet where they're going. So jump over to verse 20. And he says, And the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? It's an interesting question. Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Now we're not going to read every verse here, but the Lord continues to plead, and he says, well, what about if there were 40 people? The Lord says, I'll spare it for 40. He says, well, what about 30? I'll spare it for 30. And he starts to kind of understand that he's being repetitive, and he asks, he says, don't get mad, but just indulge my line of questioning here. What about 20? What about 10? So he eventually gets down to 10. He says, the Lord says, yes, if there are 10 people in that entire city who are living rightly, I will spare the entire city for their sakes. So we see here again the character of God. In the story of the flood, many people like to characterize God as the wrathful God, and he seeks to destroy. But we see here that that's not the case. Sodom is a city of thousands and thousands of people. And he says, if you have 10 good people there, I'm not even going to touch the city. Nobody in the city is going to get hurt. I'll spare everybody for the sake of 10 people. And we know that from the ark, he spared the 10 people from the planet. Obviously, it's a bit different situation. But again, it's the idea is God is not seeking to destroy. He destroys when he must, but he does not desire to destroy anyone, including the wicked. We haven't read it yet, but there will be a verse later that talks about that. He says, "Have I any pleasure that the wicked should die?" He says, "No, I would prefer that they turn from their ways and live." But it's interesting that Abraham gets down to 10. I don't know if you'll remember this from the previous videos, but these two towns, Sodom and Gomorrah, we recall Lot, Abraham's nephew. He went to go live in Sodom. And so Abraham is concerned for Lot and Lot's family. So that's why he keeps lowering the number. He's like, okay, well, Lot, I know Lot. Lot would be righteous. Can he spare Lot and Lot's family? And I don't know if there were exactly 10 people. I don't know if that was simply, a reasonable estimate on his part. I'm not sure. But I think that's what Abraham was most concerned with, was Lot and his people. So skipping down to chapter 19 now, we're going to read a few verses here. It says, "Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, 'Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way.' And they said, 'No, we will spend the night in the open square.' But he insisted strongly, so they turned in to him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally.' So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, 'Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please, let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof.' And they said, 'Stand back.' Then they said, 'This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them.' So they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary, trying to find the door." We're going to pause there for a moment. There's a few things to note here. One, many people are troubled by Lot's response to these men. Not that he told them to stop. They understand that that is the right thing to do. And in fact, it is that very thing that they criticize him for. You see, they say here he has come to live with us and he acts as our judge, right? Lot thinks he's so much better than us. How dare he? We're going to punish him. But they're bothered by the fact that he says, "I have 2 daughters. Please let me bring them out," right? And you can have your way with them. And it's understandable to be bothered by that. Frankly, I'm bothered by it too. But we have to understand the cultural context. And that's not a cop-out to say that it's fine that he did this. It's not an excuse. It's not to say it's okay that he did this. It's just in there to tell us that he did do this. Because in those days, throughout much of human history, we know that women did not have, equal rights to men. That's, even in America, that wasn't the case for a long time. And that's still not the case in many places. There's still a lot of places under Sharia law or what have you, and any other variant of that say, women are second-class citizens. And it was much the same in biblical times. It was, women were heavily dependent on men for, in a large part, they were dependent on them for an income. They couldn't really work on their own. And so he says, don't do some homosexual acts with these men who, came here to stay at my house, and, essentially don't rape these men. But he says, I have daughters. That's at least slightly better. At least then you're not doing something to, it's still detestable. It's still rape and awful, but it's, it's like half step down as evil, I guess. I don't know if that's his logic per se, but But you'll notice it says, now the two angels came to Sodom. And that's letting us know that the two men that were with the Lord who left Abraham to go toward Sodom were in fact angels. And we see that later as they see, they pull Lot inside and they strike them in with blindness, right? They have supernatural power. And I don't know that Lot recognized them as angels. The Bible says that some men have entertained angels and not known it, because angels are able to disguise themselves and appear mortal. Because you'll notice that he refers to them as people. He says, my lords, please come in. He just, he thinks they're, maybe high-ranking officials or something. I'm not sure. But as we continue on, they sort of make their angelness known and their purpose there known. So continuing on, beginning in verse 12 now, it says, then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whoever you have in the city, take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place because of the outcry against them that has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. So Lot takes their warning very seriously, and he tries to warn his family, but his sons-in-law don't listen. And so the angels don't take them with. And not only that, one thing I want to emphasize here is it says, he has sent us to destroy it. Now you'll recall something interesting. The Lord said, when he was talking to Abraham, I'm going to go examine the outcry against, Sodom. Essentially, people have been praying for salvation from Sodom, praying about its wickedness for many, many long time. And he says, I'm going to go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know. Now, he already knows. He's already seen everything, but he's saying, I have inspected the case and I am able to tell right and wrong and whether they are, in fact, as wicked as people have claimed them to be. And they are. And the interesting thing is, with Abraham's discussion with God, and he says, would you destroy the city if there are 50 righteous? That wouldn't be right. Would you save it for 50? Yeah, I'll save it for 50. Would you save it for 40? Yeah, I'll save it for 40. It's interesting that before he ever even has this conversation, he tells Abraham, or he sends the men ahead of Abraham, and Abraham stands back to talk to him. So these two angels were sent to destroy Sodom before the Lord even spoke to Abraham and told him, I'm going to destroy Sodom if they're evil, because he had already known, and he knew the outcome from the beginning. And you'll notice that he said, if there are 10 people, I will spare the city. And yet he knew that there were not even 10 people. But even so, he sent the angels not just to destroy the city, but to save Lot and his family. And so he says, we were sent to destroy it. But he says, get out of here, right? He's been warned. And then if we jump down to verse 24, it says, then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities and all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife, his being Lot, his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now you'll recall that they were told to leave the city. And, we skipped some passage here, but they were told, when you leave the city, do not look back. Do not, under any circumstance, look back at the city. Leave it behind. Leave nothing, don't be concerned with any of your possessions, anything. It says, leave it behind. And Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, just to, I suppose, correct an image in your mind, she did not become little table salt granules stacked up in a stack. Salt, in fact, can come in just giant blocks. So she was, as far as I know, one, essentially sculpture of salt. And as for why she looked back, we can only speculate. It doesn't say why, it just says she looked behind at the city. But under the context of God's character and who he is and the fact that he doesn't punish arbitrarily, we have to assume, of sorts, that she was looking back because she wasn't truly ready to leave the city. She did not. There were things in the city that she was going to miss, things in the wickedness that she desired, and so she was not spared. And that can be very dangerous for us. When God calls us to, follow him, he says, look, this is an all-in deal. He says, you're going to stumble. Yeah, you're going to make mistakes, but God knows the heart. He knew that Lot's wife was never going to truly let things go. And so he ended things then and there. She had made her final decision, as it were. And that's another important thing to note, is that God will never, he will never abandon a person that is still struggling to find an answer. He will never abandon somebody who is uncertain or, still has a chance to be saved. He'll never abandon that person. That person may abandon him. Obviously, that's possible. He respects our free choice. But God himself will never walk away from a person who is still willing to listen. It's only once a person has made their decision first, or finally, to where no other examples would convince them. If they saw a miracle in front of their face, they would still not believe in God and they would still not follow God. It is only at that point that God will ever cut anybody off. We saw that with the flood. That's, the entire world, aside from Noah's family, was already at that point. They were not willing to listen. They were not willing to see reason. They were not willing to do good. Nothing. They were just pure evil. And so God cuts people off. And so we see that here, with his wife. We have to assume that that's where she was. But it can be dangerous for us because, we can have those moments of wavering. And, this is sort of a testament, against us, as it were, as a reminder to say, listen, keep your eyes forward. Keep your eyes focused on where you're going, what your goal is, the message of Christ, the message of God. Focus on the word. Don't look back. Don't look at your past. Don't worry about, everything that you used to be. Don't worry about everything that you used to do. Don't worry about all the stuff that you might miss, because everything that's coming to you is better, right? Keep your eyes forward. Leave the city and don't look back. So jumping back to Abraham, we heard about what happened to Lot. And keep in mind, here's another point that I wasn't going to touch on, but I guess perhaps I should. Just came to mind. Lot, even though he did not look back, even though he obeyed, even though he was, the righteous man in the situation, essentially, trying to mitigate what was going on with the wickedness in the city, trying to, obviously he had a track record of trying to convince people to do right, because they said, he continuously acts like a judge for us, right? So Lot wasn't participating in the wickedness of Sodom. He just happened to live there. And, we see that he was, in fact, righteous as Abraham believed him to be. He, or at least he tried to be righteous, and he obeyed, but he didn't come out unscathed, right? He lost his wife and he lost his sons-in-law because they didn't listen. They, he tried to warn them and they thought he was kidding. They didn't take it seriously. And so the idea, there's no such thing as, we obey God and so therefore our lives are perfect and we have no struggles and everything's hunky-dory. That doesn't happen. That's a complete myth. Prosperity gospel is not a real thing. God does not want to make every Christian rich and super famous and have perfect health and have 1 million kids and have everything go right and all their life. That's not the point of our lives here. So it's just, it's just important to keep in mind that, in your Christian walk, you're going to have problems. It doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. It doesn't, the fact that, people have problems whether they obey or not. That's not really the issue. But jumping back to Abraham, and we're going to stay on Abraham as we finish out his story here. There are 2 or 3 more highlights to his story that are worth talking about. And an interesting one is here. So recall that Abraham is 99 at this point. recall that it has been many, many years since he was in Egypt. And I bring up Egypt, as you'll see here, in chapter 20, verse 1. We see kind of a repeat incident of something we've seen before. It says, "And Abraham journeyed from there to the south, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarai his wife, She is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, She is my sister? And she even herself said, He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this." If we skip down to verse 10, it says, "Then Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you have in view that you have done this thing?" In other words, why did you lie to me? Right? We see this callback to Pharaoh. Why did you lie to me? And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. And so we see here a repetition of what we saw in Egypt. He went to Egypt. He said, Pharaoh is going to kill me in order to get you. Tell him you are my sister, not my wife. That way he won't kill me, at least. And we see the same thing. He says, I could have been horribly, horribly punished for this. He said, I didn't know she was your wife. You lied to me and you almost got me in trouble. Same thing we saw with Abimelech. He says, God, I didn't know better. It's not my fault. Abraham lied. Abraham gives the same reasoning too. He says, I was afraid for my life. So we see it's been some 20 years and Abraham is still making the same mistake. Right? He's still fearful. He still doesn't trust God. God just came to him and said, look, you are going to have a child. That should have told him, you're going to survive for another 9 months or a year or whatever it is. But he still doesn't get it. And that's just to emphasize again, we don't always get it on the first try. 20 years later, still having the same problem. I know I'm in that camp. I've been a Christian for about 17 years or so, and I still make mistakes all the time. I don't mean all the time as in like 24/7, obviously, but we're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect people. Abraham was not perfect. We see that repeatedly, but the issue is not whether or not we make mistakes. The issue is, do we know where to turn after we make them? Abraham comes clean. He says, yes, I told you she was my sister. Technically she is. She's my half-sister. So he's trying to kind of skirt it, and he says, technically I didn't lie, technically. But, we all know that he was, at the very least, even if you don't want to call it a lie, he was deceptive on purpose. For the very reason that he gives. He was afraid for his life. And, we're only human. And I don't say that to excuse the sin of Abraham. Again, same with Lot. I don't excuse the actions, but I understand them. I understand failure. I understand moral weakness. Even later in the New Testament, we'll see a character named Paul, and he says, I do the things that I don't want to do, and I can't seem to do the things I think are good. And, it's just this eternal battle within us, good versus evil. And the important thing is not that you're perfect. The important thing is that you are continuously striving for the good, to do what is right. You're going to fail sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And that's okay. You have to forgive yourself, get up again, and move on. And Abraham does. He does not stay this way all the time. We saw in the previous sections in the last video where he, goes and courageously rescues Lot. And not only Lot, but the entire city of Sodom after they lost their war. And he says, okay, I'm just going to go save all these people because it's the right thing to do. He had no concern for his own safety. It was a completely selfless, completely altruistic, completely noble act from the same person here that we see is afraid for his own life. So he's not perfect, but Abraham is a good man. And now we come to the crux of everything we've been building to, the fulfillment of the promise in chapter 21, starting in verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, And the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So again, finally, the promise is fulfilled. But we still have some more strife. You'll recall that Hagar and Sarah were a bit at odds because Hagar had a child and Sarah didn't, and so now they were fighting back and forth, and they had this feud. And it's now flipped on the other side. So instead of Hagar sort of despising Sarah and saying, "Ha, I have the child, I am the better one. I'm the better wife," essentially. Now we see Sarah going the other way. And if we jump to verse 9, it says, "And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this bondwoman and her son. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac.' And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed.' So Abraham rose early in the morning, and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and sent her away. Then she departed, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba." So there's a rift now. We see a rift in that family. The family is torn in two. Ishmael and Isaac would never grow up as brothers, in the same household. And this is a further consequence of their own actions. Obviously, if they had not strayed from God's plan, Ishmael would not have been born. So, Ishmael, on the one hand, can be grateful that they chose that path, or he would not exist. But it's also true that there would not be this painful divide, right? There would not be this, heartbreak in Abraham, as he has to, split his sons apart. Obviously they're both his children. He loves both of them. He didn't want to send her away. It says that was displeasing to him. And he only sent her away because God said it will be okay. God had already told Hagar that he would take care of her and her son. And he told him, he said, "I will make him a great nation, so don't worry, I'll take care of them, but go ahead and send them away. There's just going to be bickering, there's going to be fighting. If you don't do it, it's going to cause problems. Go ahead and do what Sarah said, send him away." And this is what happens, whenever we take things into our own hands. It may seem like a good idea at the present. It might be something we say, what, that could work. Yeah, let's try this thing. And God says, look, if you had just been patient, if you had let me continue with my plan, things would have been much, much better. So there's a rift. And many years pass. And in the last chapter that we're going to discuss here, chapter 22, we come to what is possibly the most well-known part of Abraham's life, certainly one of the most well-known parts of Genesis. And for good reason. We see a bit of a metaphor here, and I'll explain that a little more after we read it. But let's go ahead to chapter 22, and we'll start in verse 1. "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" Jumping to verse 6. "So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and said, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' Then he said, 'Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' And Abraham said, 'My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering.' So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there, and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, and said, 'Abraham! Abraham!' So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram, and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." So again, a lot to unpack here. Number one, God asks him to sacrifice the thing that he had received in promise, right? He was not able to conceive the child on his own, but God miraculously said, "You will conceive Isaac," and here he is. And afterward, he says, "Okay, I'm going to test you. Give him back. You waited 25 years for this child, and now you've waited for the child to grow up." Abraham is maybe 110 at this point, somewhere in there. And he says, "Now you have to give him up. Are you willing to do it?" And Abraham says, "Okay, I suppose so." I'm sure he wasn't too happy about it. I'm sure he wasn't too thrilled that God had made the request, but a credit to his character, he says, "I am willing to give it." Now, some people would say, "Oh, that's horrible. He was willing to kill his own child. Well, Abraham's a monster." But we don't know Abraham's thinking. It could be that he thought, God is able to give life and death. Maybe he's going to resurrect him after the offering. Who knows? I don't know what Abraham was thinking. I do know that God did not truly need to test Abraham in order to know his faith. God knows all things. The test was more to reveal to Abraham his own faith. Abraham was likely doubtful of himself, having told the same lie to spare his own skin twice, having, failed in upholding the promise by having Ishmael. Perhaps he did not believe himself worthy to be, a servant of God. And so God says, "Listen to me. You have not withheld your only child from me. Do not doubt yourself. Your faith is genuine." It could be that that was the reason. I'm unsure. But another thing to note is that Isaac does not complain. We see no struggling from Isaac. We see no complaint from Isaac. Isaac trusts his father to do the right thing, even when it comes to sacrificing him. He may not understand why. He may not understand what's happening, but we see no record of him struggling. He allows his father to tie him up and put him on the altar. He does not beg or kick or scream. And of course, God stops him and says, "Don't touch him." And he, in fact, did provide his own sacrifice, as Abraham had said he would. But this is an interesting parallel. I know we haven't gone into the New Testament yet, but I assume that many, if not all of you watching this video, have at least heard of Jesus, the most prolific character in all of the Bible. The one whose name is the root of Christianity, Jesus the Christ. This passage is a metaphor for what God was going to do. And I believe he was revealing that to Abraham. Jesus Christ himself said, "Abraham was shown my day, and he rejoiced." And I think that, in part, this is what he was referring to. God would give his only son to be a sacrifice. Abraham was called to give his only son to be a sacrifice. God was showing Abraham, as much as you love your child, understand that I love my child. But I am willing to give my son up as a sacrifice in order to save you. Right? And that's a powerful thing. To anybody who has children, I myself have no children, but I understand in a small part, what it's like. I've babysat kids. I've watched, young kids grow up. I know, just a small portion, but I understand some of what it feels. And I understand that this was hard for Abraham. He was willing to do it, but I imagine there were tears in his eyes as he lifted up the knife. I don't imagine that this was something that he was able to just casually say, "Oh, God asked for the child. Sure, you can have the child. It's whatever." I'm sure he struggled with it. But God said, "Look, this is important for you to understand. This is what my sacrifice is about. This is how I am going to save humanity. I am going to send Jesus, and he is going to have to die." And we see that over and over in the Old Testament, actually. That sort of revealing ahead of time of what God's going to do through symbolism. It doesn't always explicitly state it. God didn't say, "Hey Abraham, I'm going to tell you a story and it's going to be symbolic about what's going to happen." It doesn't do that. But looking back, since we have the entirety of Scripture and we can see the whole picture, we can notice things like this. And this is sort of the last major point in Abraham's life. After this, it speaks of Sarah's death. It speaks of Abraham's burial of his wife, and then later the death of Abraham himself. And the Bible somewhat glosses over Isaac. It mentions him in a couple of passages, one about how he is to find his wife, and one or two other simple passages. But he's actually not who our next patriarch, if you want to call him that, is going to be. We're actually going to jump into the children of Isaac, and our next video is going to be about Jacob and Esau, two brothers that were very different. But interestingly, they have a very Isaac and Ishmael relationship in a way. So we kind of see the generational effects of what's going on. But that was all I have for you for Abraham. He was a great man who made some mistakes, but overall he was accounted as a man of faith to God. Hebrews, eventually we'll go through that book, but Hebrews says that Abraham believed in God and it was counted to him for righteousness, and he is accounted in what is called the Hall of Faith chapter, among the many people that we are to look up to in Scripture. Not because he was perfect, again, but to understand his walk and his journey with God. So that's all I have for you for this video. As I said, if you could comment and let me know whether you like this setup better or not, that would help me a lot. I mean, this is, I can't just make the elective decision. I suppose I could, but I want to know what you guys think. I want to know if you guys prefer this setup or if you prefer the just, simplicity of the blank white wall. It's up to you guys. So just let me know in the comments, or if you want to send me an email. Obviously, it's still that higherwaysqa@gmail.com. It's in the description. That's all I have for you, though. So until next time, I'll see you later.